everyone. My name is Aaron Christensen. Welcome to Horror 101 with Dr. AC, a gathering place for fellow fiends the world over to discuss all things freaky and frightening. If you'd like to be part of the conversation, and I hope you do, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, maybe go back and check out some of our previous episodes, leave a comment, and most importantly, let us know the fright flicks you'd like to discuss in the future. That kind of connection is exactly what we're looking for, and it really does make a difference. We're all about sharing the scare, and we want to hear from you. By the late 1940s, the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, and Dracula had become more friends than fiends to audiences, appealing to younger crowds with the monster rallies that began with 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, followed by 1944's House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula in 1945. Both creatively and commercially, the classic Universal monsters were running on fumes. It was producer Robert Arthur who hit upon the idea of pairing his hit comedy team of Bud Abbott and Lou Costello with the creepy creatures, marrying two of Universal's crowd pleasers into one. Though nobody, especially Abbott and Costello, were enthusiastic about the experiment, the results were astonishing. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was a huge success, one of the top grossing tickets of the year, and it later became a perennial favorite on television, which is where many monster kids in the 1950s and 1960s first became aware of it. For many, it served as an introduction to the classic monsters, creating a safe gateway, if you will, into the joys of late-night creature features and increasingly darker fare. Alongside Bud and Lou, Lon Chaney Jr. played the tortured lycanthrope Lawrence Talbot for the fifth time. Glenn Strange put in his third appearance as the old flat-top Frankenstein's monster, but the biggest thrill for many was seeing Bela Lugosi, then 65 years old, returning to Dracula's cape for the first time since the 1931 original. I'm very excited to chat about this horror comedy classic with my esteemed panel of award-winning guests, so let's get to gabbing. Come on in, everybody, and let's meet and greet Doug Long, Michael Weber, and Bobby Zier. And we're going to be talking about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from 1948, celebrating its 75th anniversary. Thank you, everybody, for coming on the show, and welcome.
Great to be here.
Happy to be here.
Hey.
So let's dive in. This was a gateway drug for me, for sure. It was this and Godzilla were the two that kind of like spurred my love of monster movies and then eventually horror movies. I'd love to just kind of go around and talk to people as to what your first experience was with the film and kind of maybe how it's changed over the years. Doug, do you mind starting us off?
Well, I saw it certainly as a kid on TV, and I've loved it ever since then. I loved back then the Abbott and Costello and the monster movies, and it's just, as you say, a really happy marriage between those two different genres. And as far as over the years, I think it really stands up, and I'm sure we'll talk today about why. But I see it as, along with Young Frankenstein, one of the two great horror comedies.
For sure. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I was born and raised in Chicago, and we had Channel 9, which annually played it on Halloween. So it was a tradition where you would get home from school, you began trick-or-treating, you came home for dinner, and they played it, I think, around 7 or 8 o'clock on Channel 9, and then you went back out. And there was something about local television that it was the same with the Marx Brothers on New Year's Eve and things like that, that you had this tradition of coming home and watching this one thing, and you all had to be there at the same time watching it. And right. Remembering that as a kid, the thing that's great about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is that for a kid, it freaks you out. There's some really genuinely, by the era, scary stuff in it, and then it's really funny at the same time. So I think I was at the right age with the right moment and was able to discover it. And it like you said, Aaron, it just opened doors to go to wanting to know more.
For sure. Both about the monsters and about just kind of like what else does this genre have in store for us?
Yeah, about horror and about comedy. And which then got me onto, Three Stooges and all other things like that. You want to know more.
Yeah. And Bobby, you run the YouTube channel Lugosi Theater, so I knew you were a big Bela Lugosi fan. We met at Flashback Weekend not too long ago, and I'm really curious to hear kind of like what it is about this film that you love so much.
Well, I first saw it. I don't remember when I first saw it. We had it on videotape, and it was like The Wizard of Oz. It was just something I grew up with, and it was great. It had all the monsters in it, so it really felt like a true Halloween movie because it had all those classic characters, Dracula, Wolfman, Frankenstein, and just like you guys, it got me interested in the Universal monsters, into horror, and into Abbott and Costello, and then later the later comedy teams. And it's just such a wonderful movie because it has all the monsters shine in it. It works as a horror movie, but like especially for kids, if ever it gets too scary, you have Abbott and Costello doing something funny.
Yeah.
So now I show it to nieces and nephews, and it's always such a big hit.
Well, and I think it is a big hit with kids is because Lou Costello is very kind of he's a big kid himself.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy for us to identify with Lou, and he's the one being scared, and Bud is the adult, and Bud never sees the monsters until much later. And so it's always that thing of like the parents just don't understand and the adults don't believe you. So I think it really resonates on that level. But as all of you said, I think the monsters aren't played for laughs here, except for very rarely. Like they are there doing what they were doing in the earlier Universal classics. They just happen to be changing gears with Abbott and Costello, as opposed to, like John Carradine or something like that.
And it's interesting that years later, Lon Chaney really had a problem with this film and pointed it out specifically as being that it single-handedly was the downfall of the Universal era. And it's just sort of like, I get kind of where you're coming from, but at the same time, I don't think that anybody feels who loves those Universal horror monsters feels that, oh, this is like, the
right. It doesn't feel like you're poking fun at them.
Yeah.
No.
Like I feel like it's treating them as monsters, and they're just interacting with a comedy team.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they feel like the iconic characters they are. Like even like in the opening credits, how you see them in cartoon form, like you see those big names, Dracula, the monster, Wolfman, like it gives them the respect they deserve.
And I love that curtain call intro.
Yeah.
Where it's like, you know them, you love them, and here we go.
Right, yeah.
The research on that cartoon suspects that it was created by Walter Lantz.
Oh,
the Woody Woodpecker cartoon.
Yeah.
And he was working at Universal at the time. And I was seeing something that had comparisons of his artwork and going, this is definitely his hand.
Cool.
In making that, yeah.
Did he do the...
Go ahead, Bobby.
I'm sorry. Did he do the animated bat transformation too?
I don't know, or if that was John P. Fulton who did the Invisible Man stuff. He was kind of the go-to special effects guy at Universal at that time.
Because I really love that transformation. The anime. They also use that in Son of Dracula. That same kind of like the bat wings turning into the cape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It didn't have the full faces. It was a weird little thing that Carradine does where he right,
yeah.
throws his arms up, and this was a little bit more elegant. Of course, it's Lugosi; it's going to be elegant.
Right, yeah. That's what I love about like how they do the transformation. Even though like it wasn't part of the original film, he owns it. It's like it feels like it's just perfect for him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and let's talk about that really quick because this was Lugosi's first time playing Dracula. Since the 1931. He famously, did not come back in any other Universal incarnation of it. He does kind of a Dracula type character in Mark of the Vampire, but
and Return of the Vampire as well.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think that people didn't really understand that he wasn't playing Dracula, and I'm sure that Columbia Studios and MGM were perfectly fine.
We're happy with that. Yeah,
thinking that it was him. My understanding is that, and this is a very strange thing, and Bobby, you probably know this because you're so up on Lugosi, but my understanding is that they first went to an actor named Ian Keith, who is an actor who they first had gone to with the 31 Dracula, and they came back to him again before even thinking of Lugosi. Like, why would you introduce a new actor? I mean, and I'm not exactly sure why they didn't like immediately go to Carradine, because by then he was already pretty much playing the role like Glenn Strange. But that they would still pass him over. And I guess it was the word on the street was that they thought he was dead.
That's what I heard too. It's so wild to think, because he's such a part of the movie, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know that he felt it was beneath him at that point. I don't know that he was, you know, it seems to me, at least, the performance he gives feels really solid, and he knows what movie he's in. He knows this is a comedy, and he knows what his role in order to make the comedy work. He knows what he needs to do.
There's a wonderful blooper that's out there of the scene where they're coming down the staircase, and Bobby Barber, who was a guy that Abbott and Costello would hire to run around on the set, you know, interrupts, and you see Lugosi bark at him,
right?
You know, we're acting, get away from me. You know, he didn't want this guy interrupting him. But I think you're right, Aaron. He was in it to win it. He was there.
And I think he's there. He was there to perform. He wasn't there to fool around. And that felt like fooling around. Yeah. I recently found out about that whole that Costello had like his clown prince that he had on set with him to keep him entertained and keep energy up.
Yeah, he's the guy who's in that scene in the locker room. Right. Have you seen Chick Young? Seen him? I don't even know him.
And it seemed like Bela had a great time doing the film. Like, there's pictures of him with his son on the set, and his son has like a lot of great memories of being there.
Yeah,
I guess they all ate at the commissary together with Lon Chaney Jr. and Wolfman costume makeup, and Glenn Strange and Frankenstein makeup.
And also, this was a kind of a turning point for Universal as well, in that this was the first film that Jack Pierce did not do the makeup for. He was famously kind of given the boot. And Doug, do you have any information about Jack Pierce? Because I know he was a little, you know, he wasn't always the warm and cuddly guy on the Universal set.
Right, somewhat of a diva, I guess, but a perfectionist, of course. And it would take hours to do the makeups for these monsters. And what Bud Westmore of the famous Westmores of Hollywood has come up with masks that they were the base of what they wore, which is apparently much easier for especially Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman.
They didn't have to do the extended, you know, putting on a little bit of yak hair at a time.
Right, yeah.
You know, they were able to use the
time-lapse transformations did still take hours, apparently.
Yeah, right. Because he still had to hold still while they applied it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think he didn't mind that too much. There are a lot of transformations over the course of this. I mean, I don't think the film takes place over more than just a couple days. And I think like Lon Chaney is like turning into a werewolf like every single night.
Oh, and those are some of the funniest moments in the film. Certainly where Wilbur, Lou Costello, is in the hotel room with him. We know that he's turning into a wolf, but of course he doesn't. And all the near misses. Then he goes back for the suitcase, or to return the suitcase. And then later in the operating room in the castle, when Lon Chaney looks up and it's a full moon, we know what's next. You know?
That scene, the first scene with Chaney when he's in London.
Yeah.
There's an impeccable piece of filmmaking that Charles Barton does. And I didn't notice it for years until somebody mentioned it. He's on the phone and you see the Venetian blinds. The moon is moving up the Venetian blinds.
Yeah.
And it's only then that he starts turning around. And like, once I realized that it happened, it made the hair on my neck go up, because Charles Barton doesn't like make a big deal about it.
Yeah,
just does it.
And it's no like cutaway to it, or
like he was really thinking this stuff through. It wasn't like simple. He was,
and it's such a dramatic introduction to the story. Mm-hmm. I love how it opens like on the horror note.
And I mean, we talked about Lugosi. Lon Chaney, I think, does a really terrific job. And it's, you know, he the Wolfman was always his baby. Never wanted anybody else to play him. And I think he does a really fun job. Apparently he wasn't wild about doing this project because he thought that they would be playing it for laughs. But again, I feel like he does a great job. He plays the film straight, and he recognizes that he's not there for the laughs, you know. And I think again that helps ground the horror.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, his Larry Talbot is still the tortured protagonist.
Mm-hmm. Well, he did, and it's interesting because he did a movie with Abbott and Costello called "Here Come the Coeds" a number of years earlier.
Okay,
Cheney, and you see him playing more for comedy, and actually, what he's doing in that movie is he's spoofing Lenny in Of Mice and Men.
Right.
And you're going, oh, he could be really funny when he wanted to be, but here he's, you know. Right. He's choosing not to. He is really kind of somehow they were able to communicate to these actors a spirit of what they were attempting to do in something that had never been done before. And the fact that they were all on the same page is really, you know, a tribute to these writers as well as Charles Barton to kind of go, you know, there's not a moment where they kind of go, well, give me a laugh. I want to be funny, you know?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. They're all like, they're also at home in their characters. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why like they're able to adapt it into this new situation. Is like Lon Chaney Jr., he knows Larry Talbot inside and out. Bela Lugosi, he knows Dracula inside and out. So they're able to fit into like the different situations.
Yeah. I mean, even the moment when they're in McDougal's House of Horrors, when the monster is shaken up when he first sees Costello and Lugosi's line, you know, don't worry, he won't hurt you. You know, you kind of go, but it automatically makes you go back to the monster in Bride of Frankenstein and go, this is a very sensitive character. He would get scared. You know, he's emotional.
Right, a tragic character. Yeah, that's right.
And even like the line, you young people making the most of life while it lasts. It goes on the same principle of I never drink. Why? It's the same joke where he knows what he's doing, but they don't.
Yeah.
The we haven't talked about Glenn Strange yet, and this was his third time around. Like he had as much right to claim the Frankenstein monster as his own. But I don't think, kind of to your point, Michael, I don't think Glenn Strange was in movies where he was given the opportunity to show the nuance and the sensitivity of the Frankenstein. This is not Frankenstein. This is not, Bride of Frankenstein. It's not even, Ghost of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So it's like, I feel like Glenn Strange was cast because he was big and because, he fit the costume at that point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what Jack Pierce said, is that he was studying him and they needed somebody after, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. Right. I mean, my God, I mean, that's a whole conversation, just the evolution of the actors and their interpretation of the Frankenstein monster and the nuances that they brought to it. Actually, I think this is the most successful version. I mean, Glenn Strange is on screen more, I think, in this movie than either of the other two.
Yeah, well,
the monster figures in. Go ahead, Doug.
Definitely in one of the funniest scenes, of course, when Lou Costello sits on his lap, not realizing that, and it's drawn out so long in the hand and then the other hand. And Michael, you mentioned outtakes. There is an outtake. Apparently, Glenn Strange could barely keep it together because Costello was so funny.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know. He later, had some good screen time in Gunsmoke. Mm-hmm. So he became a TV fixture there. But I like the fact that, this is finally the opportunity for him, because we have three actors who've played Frankenstein's monster in this film, because Bela Lugosi had played him, and in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, Chaney had played him in, was it Ghost of Frankenstein?
Yeah.
So, and then Strange had it for House of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, and this one. So it's kind of like, I wonder if Glenn Strange was ever just kind of like, I got this, no tips, please. But the Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, you have Bela Lugosi, famously submarined by the fact that, he was playing the monster as though he was blind.
Yeah.
And then they eliminated that reference. And so now he's that kind of weird, which has almost become kind of the caricature of Frankenstein's monster. Is they arms stretched out and reaching.
Yeah.
And so we don't think about the fact that you're actually imitating Bela Lugosi as Frankenstein's monster rather than Boris Karloff.
Right. And then there's the famous story of when Karloff died, they used Glenn Strange's face in Karloff's obituary.
Oh, no.
And that the Dom Post mask, the famous Halloween masks, are all of Glenn Strange, because it was there was something about his face, because he didn't have the nuance and the subtlety and the humanity of Karloff. It was more of this mechanical monster that it must have been easier just to replicate as a mask than Karloff, who was so much more human, even though he had this grotesquerie about him,
There's also another horror icon who doesn't quite appear at the very end of the film.
Genius moment. What a great perfect moment.
Oh my God. The greatest cameo you could get for this,
Well, and it's interesting because, Vincent Price, who, doesn't appear as the Invisible Man, he was not even a horror icon at that point. It's like he was just another actor, really. He was making his way. He was, coming up as a solid character actor. Yeah. But he was not, a horror icon to any degree. I mean, House of Wax was still 5 years away.
Well, he had played the Invisible Man,
right.
Which I have to wonder, did they call Claude Rains and ask him, would you throw us a bone and do this? And, I don't know. But I mean, so it's incredibly appropriate that it's Vincent Price, because he had at least played the role.
He'd already played him in Invisible Man Returns. Is that right?
Yeah. And then he was in Tower of London.
Right.
With Karloff, which was that, this weird hiccup of Universal trying to do Richard III.
39.
Yeah. But it's a great moment.
Yeah, it's lovely. And, but then again, Price goes on to become just one of he basically inherits the mantle of Crown Prince of Horror from those veterans, Lugosi and Karloff and Lon Chaney.
Yeah. Yeah. I find what's really interesting about the origin of this movie was that supposedly, from what I understand, they had talked about them doing this as a live Broadway show.
Oh, wow.
In 1943, when they were on the lot doing Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and somebody had come up and they were thinking about doing it as a Broadway musical with the Universal Monsters and Abbott and Costello, because Abbott and Costello had only they did one Broadway show, a show called The Streets of Paris, and they wanted to get back to Broadway in something. But it was the issue of the commitment of time. Mm-hmm. Also, they kind of thought, are we going to be able to do all this monster makeup, and how do we do the transformations live and all of that other stuff? And it was just like, this isn't going to work. So that it came back around again years later, this idea was able to end up in the film. Was great.
I'm so grateful that it ended up being a film instead of a show, because it has been the thing that kind of has lasted. 75 years ago was when it first premiered. And then, of course, it spawned a few more of Abbott and Costello meet. The Boris Karloff, who was not in this one, was impressed enough with how they handled it that he was the next one for Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. Mm-hmm. And then we had Meet the Invisible Man, Jekyll and Hyde, with Karloff. Mm-hmm. And then it wrapped up with 1955's Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, which is, I'm wearing the shirt, but the Mummy is, it's so funny that they made as many Mummy movies as they did, because other than the first one and A Mummy's Hand to a certain degree, I don't know that like The Mummy is anybody's favorite Universal monster.
No.
I know. I remember, like, there was one year when Spenguli, he was doing like Dracula month, Frankenstein month, and man, when it got to Mummy month, like the 4th, 5th week, it got rough.
Like, okay, we got to sit through this leg dragging, and the fact that like nobody ever sees this mummy who moves, like 1 mile an hour.
Mm-hmm. And for some reason that he's in the South in America, that he's in like Alabama.
Well, we were talking about that the other night because, like, that timeline just keeps going forward and forward and forward.
Yeah.
I think you're like by the end of the series, it's like the year 1995 in terms
Exactly.
of how far they've progressed things.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about the supporting cast. We had Jane Randolph, who was in 1942's Cat People.
Mhm.
She shows up as the investigator. And this was actually her last movie. She retired, but I think she's terrific in this. We have our, I forget who's the guy who plays McDougal, because he's hilarious.
That was the one.
Frank Ferguson.
Ray Ferguson. Yeah.
He
was a great acting teacher.
Is that right?
He worked. He was a very famous acting teacher. Worked out of the Pasadena Playhouse for many years. He trained many famous actors, Robert Preston and Tyrone Power, and a number of people who came through Pasadena Playhouse. He was quite respected, and had one of those careers in Hollywood, like Charles Lane or one of those guys who just had a face. He would come on and you go, oh, he's going to be funny, or he's going to be a real, great, protagonist or antagonist or whatever, of some kind. He was great. And that whole first scene with him and Lou Costello, I mean, the back and forth and I work 2 unions and all of that stuff. It's just wonderful.
Bobby, I do want to give our viewers a close-up of your shirt, if you don't mind, just kind of leaning in a little bit, because we have this kind of showcase of the many faces of Bela Lugosi. Thank you. And Lugosi, I don't think he ever got another role as juicy as this one.
So it's the last major studio he worked for. And it really wasn't even that major of a studio, but it was the last one.
Yeah.
So he's kind of crucial to the success of this film, I think. Our first big scare laugh scene, of course, is in when they're with the crates and with Lou, and opens a little bit, and then so it's drawn out. We're laughing and nervous the whole time. And as you said, he plays it totally straight as full out Dracula. So our little kid man is truly horrified and frightened, which is hilarious.
And that scene, I'm sorry, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
That scene they do so well together, as I always think about it, because Lou Costello, his favorite actor was Charlie Chaplin. So you see like the pathos in his performance. And Bela Lugosi, he had really good comic timing, like he does in Igor and Son of Frankenstein. So it's like they're able to meet each other halfway, in terms of like creating like that perfect tone where it's funny but suspenseful too. And I'm like,
as a kid, you could go on forever just about the hands of Lugosi and how he uses, that coming out, and he's so committed to it, and it's so unique and original. It's like Lou Costello's scare take. Nobody had, if you're impersonating Lou Costello's scare take, like if you're impersonating the hands of Lugosi, and unless you got his hands, you can't do it. But it was just so beautiful and striking.
I know, it's like every finger just is in that perfect spot. It's like a spider move.
Yeah,
like a spider legs.
Yeah.
And it's so I love that he's able to do like that hypnosis in Abbott and Costello Frankenstein, because that's like one of his signatures. But when you think he doesn't do it in the original Dracula,
right?
What I not thought about until I was reading more about this film is that they do make a Dracula error in having his reflection when he.
That's right.
Sandra.
Did you ever notice that, like, just in watching it?
I'd never thought about it before,
because I do remember. I mean, it's clearly just a reflection behind him, but yeah, it's a bit of a gaffe where you go, whoops, because they do kind of linger on it.
And if they thought of it would be a great bit, but oh well.
All right, it's an exciting scene, because like what I love about Lenore Albert and Bela Lugosi, they like operate like so on the same page in this.
Yeah.
It's like
yeah.
Well, the other, if you're following the chain, though, the other hiccup is that Larry Talbot was cured in the last film. So it's like, what went wrong? You're back, dude. It's still happening.
Well, I mean, if we know anything about werewolf movies, it's like, nope, you can just be cursed. We thought we fixed it, but sorry, thank you.
Yeah. But Lenore Abbott, you know, she was a European actor too, and I think that has a lot to do with the chemistry she had with Lugosi. They had a certain understanding just of being Europeans working, you know, in American films, and she had a very, very difficult career, and was the victim of a lot of harassment in the casting couch and all of that at the time, which really just kind of destroyed her career a bit. But it was great to have her. She came back in the next film in Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. So yeah.
Speaking of fun little like trivia, I forget, I think I can't remember why, but it's Lon Chaney Jr. in the Frankenstein makeup throwing her through the window.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Glenn Strange broke his foot.
Is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah,
but I know that like that
he picked her up and rolled off of those Frankenstein shoes. Yeah. Got
it. So then, so Lon Chaney put on the Frankenstein makeup, and boy, when he throws her through that window, you're like, oh dear.
Yeah. Well, as you said, there are plenty of Frankensteins on hand if anything happens.
That's right.
Well, I would. When he turns around, you can tell it's a different actor. When he's because suddenly he's got the flexibility and the athleticism of Lon Chaney Jr.
Yeah,
and it's sort of like what's going on. It's a very quick moment, but it's really fun.
Oh, the whole chase at the end is just so hilarious. This is a movie I would really love to see with an audience sometime.
Oh, it is. I remember the part when Lou Costello does the trick where the tablecloth comes out and everything, and he gives that quick smile to the camera, like
wall for a moment. Yeah.
Well, I actually did I presented this film for its 75th anniversary at the library, and you said something, Michael, about like being in the right place at the right time in terms of age, but I think it still works. It still works for an audience that hasn't seen it before, because we had people there that were kids. We had people there who were in their 30s, people, older like myself. And it's like, and it really just still works as a really solid comedy. And people get the jokes, and it just feels kind of timeless that way. And that's something really lovely, because, whenever I go back and revisit a film that I have great affection for and or nostalgia, I'm kind of like, oh man, does this hold up? Does it still have the magic? Will I still be transported back to when I was 8 years old watching it? And the answer is yes. And I think, as I said earlier, the idea of Lou Costello kind of being our avatar, like we are immediately taken into that place of innocence where things do go bump in the night, and you do have your best friend that has your back.
It's interesting that I've seen it in a movie theater as well with an audience, and I agree with you that the visceral reaction is still very live. But in the canon of Abbott and Costello films, this one has significantly less of their sort of patented burlesque routines.
Sure.
And I think it's one of the things that makes the film. It keeps it a little bit more of an evergreen, with the exception of the moving candle bit. It's not a lot of those, like, we're going to step out of the scene and do one of these brilliant wordplay things. Much more.
I think that's part of why Lou Costello was so resistant to doing this at the beginning, because that was their stock in trade, was the wordplay, the who's on first. But I think the reason for me this is their best movie, or at least the one that still plays as well, is because theaters conflict, and in Buck Privates and those movies, which are a lot of fun, the army and a sergeant just don't have the weight of these monsters in terms of what they're up against.
And it's also a reminder, and people say this, in retrospective when they study comedy teams, and Groucho Marx had said Bud Abbott was the best straight man in the business, bar none. He said he was better than Chico, even who was working as basically his straight man. But the thing about this movie is it also tips you off as to what a great actor Bud Abbott is. There's that wonderful scene with Chaney the morning after when the mob is out and they're hiding in the reeds, and Bud is, there's a genuine concern about whether they're going to make it out of there alive, because they're being hunted, and they think that, Bud Abbott is, he's on the run with the same kind of tension as like of Mice and Men hiding, with the mob after you. He was a really good actor. And it's so much of, I think, what made them so successful was that it was more than just mechanical routines. He really, if you watch him as an actor, he's always listening. He's always reacting. He's never preparing. It's not in the can.
I always thought that was like what made Abbott and Costello like so perfect for this was like they felt like real people. Mm-hmm. Like they did the things, but like Three Stooges, they never really felt like real people. The Bartons never really felt like real people. Abbott and Costello felt real, and I think that's why it works as horror, because there's like the stakes are real in it.
And it's sort of this collision of, this is maybe taking it a bit too far, but the thing about Abbott and Costello was that they were urban comedians. You believe that they lived in New York. You didn't know where, like the Marx Brothers, where do they live? I mean, they could be in Europe anywhere, but these were New York, working guys in the street, selling ties and doing whatever they were doing. So it's this sort of America colliding with this European sense of horror. Yeah. And it seems so, elevated, because it's not like an American kind of thing that they're running up against.
Right. I would like to mention the scene that you were talking about with Bud Abbott and Lon Chaney Jr. Mm-hmm. I absolutely love the moment when Larry Talbot, he's going to give himself to the police, but as soon as he says, he's got Wilbur, they got Wilbur, and they got Joan. Right away, Larry Talbot is like, we got to get him.
Yeah.
And I really like that, like, development for his character, because like in the past movie he's just been so tortured. He's still tortured, but like he has a purpose now, like to destroy Dracula.
Yeah, he gets a moment to be a hero, right?
Yeah.
Like it really kind of pushes the hero button. Going back to Bud Abbott, I didn't realize this until I just listened to the commentary in preparation for this, but I didn't realize Bud Abbott had epilepsy.
Yeah,
and he had to be done filming by 4 p.m. every day. Like they couldn't go longer because he needed to go home.
He had a drinking problem as well, which, it's one of those kind of famous situations where, he says, I'm not good after 4 o'clock. And a lot of that was connected with the fact that he was so afraid that he would go into a fit.
Right.
He didn't drive his entire life. People drove him. He had people, who would handle that. And early on in their burlesque career on stage, they had a sort of a signal to each other where if he was slipping into an epileptic episode, Lou was given permission to punch him in the solar plexus on stage to snap him out of it, to get him off stage. And he had a certain lifelong terror of this at a time when, it was not understood. There was not it was not something he wanted to have public. And you had to get him out of there by 4 o'clock.
It's just one more thing where you just have such immense respect for these people, especially he didn't go public with it. And then you find out later, and like this artist, who's so good at what he does and operating with this happening in the background. It's kind of amazing.
He was always so 100% in there. Like you would never know he was battling that behind the scenes.
Charles Barton apparently made a comment that he said the real monsters on the set were Abbott and Costello.
Yeah. Well, these guys, I mean, they were the top money makers at Universal. They saved Universal, in the early 40s.
The war years,
with Deanna Durbin, who was a sort of an opera singer. When the studio had already been, Lemley lost the studio already, and then they had come in and kind of saved it. But this is on the precipice. This is nearing that moment. Like you said, these are older guys now. Martin and Lewis have already appeared on the scene. They've got a radio show. People are starting to know who they are. And they're beginning to see, the end of like, how long can they keep going as well? So it must have been, the whole thing was this conflagration of this is our last go between the monsters and Bud and Lou. And can we get, one more in the can here?
Well, and
Yeah,
how
and sent them back to the top of, or the top 10 moneymakers,
right.
which they
Well, and
had.
how interesting that the Universal monsters are what saved Universal back in the early 30s,
Right,
you
yeah.
know, and then Abbott and Costello do it in the 40s, and then here at the end of the 40s, you know, the two of them team up and do it again.
Yeah. My understanding is, I guess in the earlier scripts, I mean, I'm not sure if when it was still called Brain of Frankenstein, that they were talking about they wanted the Mummy in this as well, as well as like the Brides of Dracula.
Wow.
And some other, I don't know whether, not Dr. Jekyll, or whether like some kind of other,
And as a kid, because I mean, I know now, like Creature from the Black Lagoon was made later, but when I was little, I always I would wonder, like, why isn't the Creature from the Black Lagoon there? There's water.
I mean, I'm sure had he been around, they would have found a way to throw him in there.
Right, digitally insert like a final cameo.
They met the Creature from the Black Lagoon on television in the 50s on the Colgate Comedy Hour. There's video of it, and it was the introduction of the Creature from the Black Lagoon. The first time all public audiences saw them was in an episode of the Colgate Comedy Hour with Abbott and Costello, and it was sort of Universal testing the audience reaction to the costume. And it's sort of like a McDougal's House of Horror thing. And then I'm guessing it's Ben Chapman busts out of like a crate, very similar to like what they had the Frankenstein monster in, and there's the Creature from the Black Lagoon.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. But everybody had to deal with Abbott and Costello at some point.
As comedians, it's such an interesting time in history because you mentioned already they started in vaudeville. They teamed just a few years before this, or before when it got into movies, and then during this they were able to cross promote from their radio shows and on TV. Those things wouldn't happen today. We still have very funny comedies, but it's not all these platforms that they are on.
Did you guys ever hear the radio show where Abbott and Costello are going to a haunted house and it's Bela Lugosi's haunted house?
Yeah.
No.
Around the same, it was filmed around this. It was made on their radio show around the same time. And there's also one with Lon Chaney.
Oh, wow.
They were both done in 47, 48 when they were filming on the radio show as like cross. Wow. Yeah, it's awesome.
If I can find those, or if any of you find those when this goes up, throw it in the comments.
You got it.
Because it would be great to have people be able to enjoy those as well. All right. Well, thank you so much. Any final thoughts? I'll just kind of go around again, but any final thoughts on Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein? Doug?
No, as I said before, I see it as one of the big two comedy horror movies. It's different than Young Frankenstein, though. That is more an in-house theater, or movie look at. I don't know. It's more of an adult Mel Brooks style, and this is clearly a vaudeville meets the early 30s monsters, which just still plays so funny.
Michael?
I think the thing that always strikes me about this film is just how right they got it and how easily they could have gotten it wrong.
Yep.
And I don't know, where that lands in terms of whether it was the writing, the producing, all of it put together, but there was an alchemy that happened here that was just so perfect that there's so many people who love this film and they hearken to it, and it's got lasting power. Like, I think that they never would have imagined that it would have when they released it. I think that they thought it was just like, ugh, this is ridiculous. And it's like their most famous film.
Yeah. Bobby?
I think it's The Wizard of Oz of Halloween. It's such a great family movie you could watch for all ages. And I when I show it to nieces and nephews, a lot of times the next day they'll be pretending they're one of the monsters. Like my one niece, she grabbed the blanket and was going around the house like Dracula. And then too, as a Bela Lugosi fan, I think it's a great Dracula adventure too. It's got the scary castle. He gets to be the mastermind trying to restore the Frankenstein monster. So it's a great comedy and a great horror movie.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Dracula feels very contemporary. In the original 31, he's a little more kind of classical, and this one feels like he is of that world. His language is even contemporary. And it just all blends together. I think you hit it on the head, Michael. It's some kind of crazy chemistry that, nobody could have. I mean, I think they were just throwing something against the wall and going, maybe, but I don't think they could have imagined that it would be as successful as it was. Well, thank you all again so much for coming on. This was great fun. Again, this is one of my favorite movies, and it was great to be able to chat about it with fans such as yourself. We'll have you on again real soon.
Thank you so much.
Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.